In the aftermath of World War II, while Europe lay in ruins and the United States emerged as a triumphant superpower, the Soviet Union stood equally victorious but at a tremendous cost. Over 27 million Soviet citizens had perished, cities from Stalingrad to Kiev had been reduced to rubble, and the scars of famine, forced labor, and terror ran deep. Yet paradoxically, out of this devastation, the USSR emerged stronger than ever before. Under Joseph Stalin, the nation was rapidly reconstructed with ruthless efficiency. Eastern Europe was carved into satellite states. The Red Army didn't retreat, it stayed, turning Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, and others into ideological extensions of Moscow. The world was suddenly bipolar. Capitalism versus communism, NATO versus Warsaw Pact, America versus the Soviet Union. But what the world didn't fully see in those early post-war years was the internal rot already forming inside the Soviet structure. While the West encouraged innovation, decentralization, and consumer culture, the USSR doubled down on state control, five-year plans, and paranoia. Beneath the surface of the parades, the rockets, and the medals, the machinery of the Soviet system had flaws baked into its core flaws that wouldn't become visible for decades. What looked uncheckable from the outside was already beginning to crack within. The death of Joseph Stalin in 1953 was both a relief and a reckoning. He had ruled the Soviet Union with an iron fist, engineering mass purges, gulags, and fear so deep that even high-ranking officials were terrified to speak freely. Yet his methods had held the empire together through war and rebuilding. His sudden absence left a power vacuum, and with it, a dangerous uncertainty. Would the Soviet Union continue under terror or evolve into something more human? Enter Nikita Khrushchev, the man who dared to denounce Stalin. In 1956, during the 20th Party Congress, Khrushchev delivered a secret speech that shattered the cult of Stalin. He condemned the purges, the show trials, and the totalitarian grip that had defined Soviet life. It was revolutionary and deeply destabilizing. Across the Soviet bloc, cracks began to show. Hungary rose in rebellion, and other satellites trembled. Inside the USSR, the people were caught between hope for reform and fear of backlash. Khrushchev tried to push forward with de-Stalinization, but the system he inherited was not designed for change. It was built on control, and control doesn't die quietly. Khrushchev's vision of a softer, more humane socialism collided with the realities of Cold War rivalry. He poured resources into agriculture and consumer goods, but the Soviet economy, bloated and inefficient, could not match Western productivity. His Virgin Lands campaign aimed to feed the nation but ultimately failed. Worse yet, Khrushchev's bombastic foreign policy, marked by incidents like the U-2 spy plane crisis and the humiliating Cuban Missile Crisis, undermined Soviet prestige. To his critics, he was reckless and inconsistent. By 1964, he was quietly removed from power by his own party, signaling that reform had limits and dissent had consequences. His successor, Leonid Brezhnev, offered stability, but at a cost. The USSR entered a period known as the era of stagnation. Economic growth slowed, the bureaucracy ballooned, corruption became systemic. But for the average Soviet citizen, life seemed predictable, even safe. Rents were cheap, jobs were guaranteed, and the superpower status remained intact. But beneath this surface calm, the system was rotting. Factories produced obsolete goods, collective farms wasted resources, and the Soviets' obsession with military parity with the United States drained the economy dry. The Cold War had become a war of endurance, and the Soviet model was quietly losing. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, the illusion of Soviet invincibility was faltering. The empire was overstretched, both economically and ideologically. Oil exports, the lifeline of the Soviet budget, were no longer enough to sustain its bloated military and subsidy-heavy domestic economy. Basic goods were often missing from shelves. Black markets thrived. Corruption and nepotism were so entrenched that even mid-level managers lived better than the workers they were meant to serve. While the KGB crushed political dissent, the true rebellion was already happening in silence, in the minds of the people, tired of lies. And then came Afghanistan. In 1979, the Soviet Union invaded the mountainous country to support a faltering communist regime. What was meant to be a quick intervention turned into a decade-long quagmire, eerily reminiscent of America's Vietnam. Tens of thousands of Soviet soldiers died. Billions of rubles were spent. International condemnation followed. And at home, the war became an open wound, an unspoken shame in a culture built on strength. It was the first time many Soviets began to feel they were not part of a rising superpower but a giant in decline. The myth of unstoppable Soviet strength was unraveling. If you've made it this far, you clearly care about real history. So hit subscribe, there's much more to uncover. In 1985, a new face emerged at the helm of the Soviet Union. Mikhail Gorbachev, young, articulate, and most importantly different. At just 54, he broke the mold of geriatric Soviet leadership. While the world saw a reformer, the party saw a pragmatist. Gorbachev understood what few dared to admit aloud. The Soviet Union was dying from within. The economy was stagnant, the people disillusioned, and the state machinery rusted through with lies and inefficiency. But instead of tightening control, he opened the gates gradually, then irreversibly. He launched Perestroika, restructuring, aimed at reviving the economy through limited market reforms and decentralization. But economic reform alone wasn't enough. To make it work, he needed the truth, and that required glasnost, openness. Censorship was relaxed. Newspapers began publishing real news. Citizens discussed politics openly for the first time in generations. It was a tectonic shift in Soviet life. Yet with every truth revealed about Stalin's crimes, about Afghanistan, about empty store shelves, the people's faith in the system eroded further. Gorbachev thought transparency would save the Union. Instead, it began to peel it apart. Gorbachev's reforms were meant to save the Soviet Union, but their ripple effects went far beyond Moscow. For decades, Eastern Europe had been held in place by tanks and fear. But now, as Soviet control loosened, satellite states began to stir. First came Poland, where the Solidarity movement, once banned, was legalized. Then Hungary opened its border with Austria, allowing East Germans to flee to the west. The pressure built like a dam ready to burst. And then, in 1989, it did. In city after city, Prague, Budapest, Bucharest, Berlin, protesters filled the streets, demanding freedom. The old regimes collapsed, one after the other. Most astonishing of all was the fall of the Berlin Wall. On November 9, 1989, East German authorities, overwhelmed and confused, allowed citizens to pass freely into West Berlin. Crowds swarmed the wall, tearing it down piece by piece. For decades, it had stood as the ultimate symbol of Soviet domination. Now it was rubble beneath the feet of jubilant citizens. Gorbachev, to the shock of many, did not send tanks. He allowed the revolutions to unfold. It was a noble act, but also a fatal one. The moment Eastern Europe broke free, the myth of a unified communist world was shattered. The Soviet sphere was unraveling in real time. While Eastern Europe cast off its Soviet-backed regimes, the internal stability of the USSR itself began to crumble. The Soviet Union was never a singular nation. It was a complex federation of 15 republics, each with its own language, culture, and historical grievances. Under glasnost, these suppressed identities surged back to life. In Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, national movements began openly calling for independence. In Georgia, Armenia, Ukraine, and beyond, protests erupted demanding autonomy or full separation. What had once been labeled anti-Soviet activity was now broadcast on state TV. Gorbachev tried to preserve the Union through compromise, proposing a new federation treaty that would grant more autonomy while keeping the republics tied to Moscow. But it was too little, too late. The people didn't want reform, they wanted out. Even within Russia itself, nationalist sentiment grew. The Soviet identity, built over 7 decades of propaganda and sacrifice, was dissolving before their eyes. The centralized control that had once crushed dissent was now paralyzed, unsure whether to crack down or negotiate. The giant was losing its grip on its own limbs, and each one was beginning to walk away. As the Soviet Union fractured, a new figure emerged not from the Politburo, but from within the Russian Republic itself: Boris Yeltsin. Once a high-ranking party member, he had become a fierce critic of Gorbachev's slow reforms. Charismatic and populist, Yeltsin positioned himself as the voice of ordinary Russians, those who waited in endless food lines while bureaucrats lived in privilege. In 1990, he was elected president of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, the largest and most powerful of the 15 republics. Suddenly, there were two centers of authority, the USSR under Gorbachev and Russia under Yeltsin. What followed was an internal Cold War. Yeltsin began to bypass Gorbachev's authority, signing economic deals and asserting Russian sovereignty. He called for full democracy, a market economy, and the dismantling of Soviet structures. Gorbachev, still hoping to preserve the Union, found himself increasingly irrelevant. The military, the KGB, and the Communist Party were split. The public, impoverished and exhausted, watched the two leaders spar while the shelves remained empty and inflation soared. Power was slipping from the Kremlin into the hands of a populist in Moscow. The Soviet Union no longer spoke with one voice. It spoke in echoes and contradictions. In August of 1991, with the USSR on the verge of collapse, hardliners from the Communist Party, KGB, and military launched a desperate last move, a coup d'état. While Gorbachev vacationed in Crimea, a group of senior officials declared a state of emergency, cut communications, deployed tanks in Moscow, and placed Gorbachev under house arrest. They called themselves the State Committee on the State of Emergency, claiming they were saving the Union from chaos. But what they triggered instead was its final unraveling. Moscow didn't submit. Thousands of citizens took to the streets. Protesters surrounded the Russian White House, where Boris Yeltsin, defiant and fearless, climbed atop a tank and called for resistance. Television crews captured the moment. It was broadcast worldwide. Soviet soldiers, uncertain and unwilling to fire on their own people, began to defect. After just 3 days, the coup collapsed. Gorbachev returned, but it was over. His authority had vanished. Yeltsin emerged as the true leader of Russia. The myth of Soviet invincibility had died, not with an invasion, but with a broken coup and a man on a tank. In the weeks following the failed coup, the Soviet Union unraveled at breathtaking speed. One by one, republics declared independence: Ukraine, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Georgia, and the rest. Some held referendums, others simply walked away. The Communist Party was banned, its assets seized. Red flags were lowered across the former empire. Soviet ministries were dissolved. There was no civil war, no battle in the streets, just the quiet, stunned silence of a nation watching its identity disintegrate. Gorbachev remained president in name only, increasingly irrelevant, while Boris Yeltsin began building a new Russian state on the bones of the old. Then in December 1991, the final act came. In a secluded forest residence in Belovezhskaya Pusha, the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus signed an agreement declaring that the Soviet Union ceased to exist. A few weeks later, Gorbachev resigned, delivering a somber televised speech. Behind him, the red flag with hammer and sickle fluttered one last time over the Kremlin. That evening, it was replaced by the white-blue-red flag of the Russian Federation. After 69 years, the Soviet experiment was over. The Cold War was over. An empire built on revolution, steel, and fear had died not with a bang, but with a signature. The fall of the Soviet Union didn't bring instant freedom or prosperity. It brought confusion, collapse, and chaos. Across the newly independent republics, entire economies imploded overnight. State-owned factories shut down. Savings evaporated with hyperinflation. Black markets exploded. In Russia, the 1990s became a decade of humiliation. Mafias ruled the streets. Oligarchs seized national assets in rigged privatizations, and millions slipped into poverty. The once mighty Red Army was reduced to underpaid conscripts and rusting equipment. National pride, so deeply embedded in the Soviet psyche, lay shattered on the ground. In the former Soviet republics, the shock was no less brutal. Civil wars broke out in places like Georgia, Tajikistan, and Moldova. Ethnic tensions that had been frozen under Soviet rule now boiled over. Borders were redrawn, alliances reformed, and identities reconstructed. Some nations embraced democracy and Western alignment. Others fell into authoritarianism or turmoil. What united them all was a deep, collective trauma, the experience of waking up in a world where everything familiar had vanished. The hammer and sickle was gone, but its shadow still loomed, long and bitter, over a broken generation. The Soviet Union is gone, but it never truly disappeared. Its legacy survives in border disputes, in cold apartments heated by Soviet-era pipes, in schoolbooks rewritten a dozen times, and in the memories of those who lived through both tyranny and triumph. For some, the USSR was a prison of nations. For others, it was a symbol of dignity, of order, of a time when their country stood shoulder to shoulder with the United States. That ambiguity, the simultaneous nostalgia and trauma, is what gives the Soviet collapse its haunting power. In the decades since, new powers have risen, old ideologies have returned in new forms, and Russia has once again sought to reclaim a place on the world stage. But the fall of the Soviet Union remains a defining moment in modern history, not just for Eastern Europe, but for the entire planet. It marked the end of the 20th century's great ideological war. It redrew maps, rewrote futures, and shattered myths. And though its red banner no longer flies over the Kremlin, the Soviet Union still lives in memory, in consequence, and in the unresolved questions it left behind.